It's kind of interesting how you try to rationalize and justify the things that you do in life at times. The model railroading thing is kind of like the racing the motorcycle thing. You do it because you feel like it, not because there's some reason that somehow benefits you on the bottom line or some major quality of life increase, other than it keeps your brain active and allows you to do things that are interesting to you. It's sort of a selfish pleasure. The beauty about model trains is it's easier to share with other people in your world, so there's a benefit there. But one of the side things that happens when you get into this kind of a thing is most people start wanting to study. It's not just about the engine and the speed and the road names and some arbitrary list of how many different models that Lionel made of these stupid things. It turns into something where, for me, for example, I was interested in the Lehigh Valley, Erie, Lackawanna railroads, that area of the world as a kid. So I asked myself, I kind of went back through a little bit of self-reflection because I have the time to do that now. And why would that be? And it's really just as simple as this. When I was looking at trains as a kid, and I loved them, my dad first gave me one of these ALCO FAs, the New Haven, like I said before. So you plant that seed, it's in my mind. And as a kid, I was just, rabid looking for information on trains and railroads. And every time I went through the picture books, you'd see all these Pennsylvania railroad pictures and railroads of that era after the 30s into the 40s, after the Second World War into the 50s, and they had the mix of the steam and the diesel, and they're all climbing hills. It was more spectacular. So being a young kid interested in things exciting and powerful, I gravitated there as an interest. So all that goes dormant for years as I go travel around the world and do stuff like that, learn about people and politics and business and things. Now, as a retired guy, kind of comes back kind of in an arbitrary way. We have kids that might be coming to live here for a little bit. And, of course, you want to bring things that brought joy to your life, but also education to your life as a child into their world. That's part of what a parent is, Grandparents are that on steroids. So, out come the trains. The decision was either to get rid of them and make space or turn them into something that was fun. And it bit. Again, shouldn't be surprised because it bit when I was a kid. First from the mechanical side, and then from the things that look cool. I happen to like the look of the F3 series, but I had FAs, so plus the fact that I had the 031 radius track, the ALCO FAs can turn a sharp circle. The engineer side of me comes out. I went back to these and found it was a cheap way to scratch that itch, hack and modify and learn about the trains again, so we did that. Didn't put a lot of money into it, got a lot of results out of it, kind of covered that just a little bit. But the next part of it is sort of a historical discovery. And I learned, because I've been photographing now for quite some time, the New York, Susquehanna, and Western Railroad. Well, the roots of that happen to intersect with the railroads that I used to look at as a youth, Erie, Lackawanna, those railroads coming up out of Pennsylvania, hauling coal to the central part of New York State and the western part of New York State. So that connected dots there. And of course, the ALCOs, kind of like the underdog of the locomotive world, you have all these online videos and historical things that how terrible the ALCO was and how the 244 was the demise of the company and all that. And that opens up another whole area of interest, and that's the historical impact of these things. So yeah, the ALCO wasn't the success that, say, EMD F3 through F9 series was, but they actually hold a lot of material. And the first generation of the 244s did have some substantial issues, and there's a lot of documentary online about that, cranks and bearings and things like that. But they improved, and eventually they got them to be somewhat reliable. Of course, ALCO came out with the 251. There's a version of the FA, I guess they call it an FPA, that had the 251, and that version of the diesel that ALCO produced was very reliable, and they're out there now. You see the RS series, the Century series, and There's a couple of YouTube channels that have a lot of those old ALCOs. Very, very reliable design. So the next part of that is the technology that ALCO provided over the years was quite competitive. The 251 was definitely competitive. And they've definitely stood the test of time, you know. But now there's a bigger picture. What happened to ALCO as a company? Start delving into that. I completely reject the short-sighted view that a specific product or period of time is what put ALCO under. And you sort of step back and realize that ALCO is the microcosm of many other things, basically everything from countries to large companies, where you have innovative people who construct out of basically the resources at their disposal, innovative products. They build themselves a niche in the marketplace. Believe it or not, ALCO was one of the first companies to come up with a diesel electric locomotive, and they did that for the New York Central lines really early on. It wasn't that they didn't know how to do it, and it certainly wasn't their lack of understanding the importance of diesel locomotives. But there's a lesson in all this. If you go back and look at the history of ALCO, during the Second World War, since ALCO happened to be building arguably the best steam locomotives, they were told to continue to do so because they didn't have the freedom to also go into the diesels. They really didn't. They had some diesels out there, but they couldn't develop and go whole hog into the development of diesels like EMD did. And it was that intervention from outside the company that basically turned them into a second-rate diesel producer, not their ability to innovate. And by the time the 50s came along, EMD had such a huge head start that it was very hard for ALCO to catch up. And they did it, arguably, with the 251s. But it was really already the momentum, the market momentum had shifted away from them. And then, like everything else, the too big to fail syndrome happens, where you have greed that happens in two different levels, both financial and in political power. Those forces within the country and those forces within the company is eventually what took them down. And there's a couple of really, really good documentaries about that done by a local professor out there, and you can find it online. And there's lessons in that, not just for ALCO, the company, but for a lot of other things. It translates into a lot of other events. So model railroading, really, when you start trying to model an era or a series of railroad lines, if you do the natural thing that a lot of people do and expand the horizons about what are they supposed to look like first, what did they haul second, and what was their position in history third, makes you think about all these other larger issues and turns into something really, really, really interesting. So I'm not going to go any further with that, but the more I look at this and the more I see, the more other subjects get wrapped into that one thing called model railroading, because it's really about modeling a little piece of history and a little piece of the country in my mind. Back to the little ALCOs, little engines that could, the underdogs of the railroad world of that period of time. And I think they actually did pretty well. When you look at them in context of what they had to deal with over time, they actually pulled a lot of freight. And the 244, the original ones, were problems, yeah. They ironed them out. The FA2 series, released in the late 40s, 50s, was much better than the first version. And they continued making that 244 into the 50s, and then 251 took over. Now, these little guys didn't get the benefit of the 251 engine because they had sorted out the 244 to the point where it was adequate. It was okay. And a lot of those FA units ended up going into the secondary short lines and stuff like that and continued for a long time. And then, of course, the FPAs with the 251s, there are some of those out there even now. Now, of course, with the FPAs, there's like a Dash 4 version. There's one just west of us. Those things are still pulling cars now for excursion trains. So it's not all doom and gloom for the little ALCO FA series. And I've done some research in the railroad lines that I'm interested in, from that central Pennsylvania coal mining area, the Erie, Lehigh Valley, and then, of course, Erie, Lackawanna. They all had them. So The problem I'm going to have is Lionel didn't make any shells with those particular road names. They did an Erie with the die-cast frames, but they didn't do any of those Pennsylvania lines with the sheet metal. The only East Coast railroad that they did for the sheet metal version of these little ALCOs with the New Havens. So, but from what I understand, I did some research, I found that actually the Erie Railroad had a whole bunch of them. They had like 44, 45 of them. And the Lehigh Valley had 20 of them. The New Haven had over 40 of these things. So they were out there in those railroad colors, you know. So what I need to do is find pictures so I can get these shells painted or paint them myself. But, and of course, back to the history side, you know, full circle, turns out that the Erie got blended in with Erie Lackawanna, eventually was the precursor to the New York Susquehanna and Western that goes by my place now, so it's a small world. All that happened, all that research, and then, of course, all the ancillary knowledge, which doesn't mean much to anyone but me, happened because I started researching what railroads had these little ALCO FA diesel locomotives. And of course, then I wanted to find out what Lionel had, and found out they only had New Haven, and off and running we go. So there's a lot more to model railroading than just whether or not it's got computers and controls and does it sound good and make whistles and all that kind of crap. There's a historical component that almost is inevitable for a person to run into once they get into these things if they want to model a section of the world or a particular railroad line. And I would urge people, when they get into this, if they get into this, to take that next step. Take a look at the history surrounding the railroad that you happen to be wanting to model. And in my case, these Pennsylvania coal mining railroads really had a big part in American history. And ALCO itself had a huge part in American history. And learning about that, I think, would be very, very important to not just yourself, but also your kids. So Lionel never made a Lehigh Valley FA1 or 2 for the sheet metal framed ALCOs. And they made some New Havens, and so I've got some bodies I can hunt for in the New Havens if I choose to go that direction. And the only Erie FA bodies they made were for the die-cast chassis, not the sheet metal chassis. So I'm going to end up having to paint these, is what it is. And the other thing is, Lionel had many, many different options for this whole series of ALCO FAs on the sheet metal frame. And the most basic version was these right here. And what I mean by basic is the options that they had were things like whether or not it had magnetraction and lights and the reversers and stuff like that. Well, this one here had none of that. It just had a very basic motor with no magnetraction. It did have a light, but it did not have a reversing unit. And they made the Texas Special. They seem to like those darn things. The 1055 is what this one is, that very basic model. They had a 210 and a 211, and there were slightly different options. So we'll delve into that a little bit. One of the things I want to highlight is what happens after we've made some of the modifications. I have a 12-car train, and this is the powered A and a powered B, both of them modified. This one does not have the original powered truck. It has an MPC era powered truck and chassis. And this one here has a hacked up chassis with a magnetraction version of that pull more powered truck. Let's see what it does. See if it can pull my hill. Pin number 2, about 14 volts. So it has no trouble, you know, and I could probably hang on more cars. So the limitation of this FA A unit and B unit combination is really not based on how much it can pull. I can pull every car I've got here probably up that hill with it. It's got the traction and the power. Its limitation is going to be the couplers on the cars. And I was kind of careful in that I tried to match up the cars so that the height of the couplers was roughly the same. And that's how I was successfully able to pull the 12 cars with that particular setup right there. But that's what you get by modding these things, you know. This is the modified FA set that I did, where basically I took the dummy and I put a MPC era chassis underneath that and then modified the hook so it can actually pull. So I've got this one set to run backwards, this one to go forwards. Let's see whether or not that set can pull the same 12 cars up the hill. No problem. So this one was a success in my mind. That's exactly what I was looking for, is that kind of tractive effort. 1960s era Magna traction, needs a dust cover, and then two MPC era motors on the modified A unit there, and on this hacked and modified. See, I bought that whole chassis and stuck it on there. I need to put some weights on that one to really get the true potential out of it. Same with this one, I need to put some weights on them. But here's the as delivered 211. Let's see if it can pull 12 cars. See how far we get. See if I can give it a little bit of help. So that's why I did what I did with these things right here. It's not that it was running out of horsepower, but it was running out of tractive power. So I would deem these as a success. What do you think about this old monster? Huh? If you remember on my ALCO FA video, the first one I did, I was trying to get a sense of which one pulled the best. And if you remember, my MPC era pretty much pulled 10 cars up around that track. And I'm not sure it would pull 12, but it certainly pulled 10. Let's go back and see how this little guy compares when it doesn't have Magna traction, it doesn't have weights, it doesn't have much of anything. My question to you is, do you think that's going to pull one car up that hill? My guess is maximum of 3, but let's go see. You know, I think my little hill is kind of like a redneck dynamometer. On the chainsaws, we go through and measure how fast we can cut through a block of wood or a log, and then compare one to the next. Well, this little grade we have right here is kind of the same thing. So this is like the tale of 3 Texas Special ALCOs. This being kind of the original low-cost, entry-level model that Lionel had put out in, I think, 1958 or 59. Now, I believe this 211, they had a 210 that came out in between that was kind of, had more options. And the 211 came out in the 60s, and I believe it came out with 2 different runs, and this was the later of the 2 runs. This is the modified dummy that I had, and it got an MPC era chassis with a much upgraded hook, so I can have it running backwards and actually pull something. And of course, it's got that MPC era truck that has the rubber bands on the wheels. This one is as I bought it, and I'm not sure whether or not that's an original powered truck anymore, or is that an MPC era as well, because it has the same characteristics as this one does. And I know this is an MPC era. And I'm not sure Lionel did that. I'm not sure if this was like a late 60s, or is this actually an MPC era chassis sitting underneath a 211 that somebody had done prior to me purchasing, and I didn't know. It's possible. You can interchange all that stuff. It's part of the good news. Either way, I've got two powered FAs, and they both run excellent. And this one here, with that hook, I can have it run backwards and pull a lot of cars, as you just saw. The as-delivered one's got that little wimpy plastic thing, and it just flexes and breaks, you know. So I can't pull much with that. It has to be a leader. And, of course, we have this one right here. It doesn't even have a hook. But it's got pickouts for lights, and it's got a 1950s era truck, but it does not have magnet traction. And the way you can tell it does not have magnet traction is look at the diameter of those little axles versus those. Those are the magnetic axles. Now, in doing research, I actually found what road names were offered with what options on these old 200 series ALCOs. They only had two that didn't have magnet traction. They had some that just had one axle magnet traction. And then they had a bunch with the two. So they actually had 3 versions of those powered trucks. And of course they added lights or couplers and E-units for forward and reverse as options, along with the road names. I'm not sure you guys are interested in that detail, but and the other thing I found out is that the road names that I'm interested in modeling, they all had ALCO FAs and FB both in the 1 and 2 versions, FA1s and FA2s, and the FB1s and FB2s. And that would be the Erie Railroad, the Lehigh Valley, and the New Haven. And the Erie Railroad had like almost 44 of them, 45 of those things that they had bought in the late 40s. The Lehigh Valley had 20 of them, and the New Haven had something like 44, 45 of them. So it will be accurate when I get them painted properly to model the Lehigh Valley or Reading. I haven't decided which. But I've got all these cars in Lehigh Valley, and they're coal cars, so I might take that route. Back to the tale of the 3 Texas specials. Cheap and cheaper. I don't know how to say this. But let's see whether or not that one right there can pull anything up the hill. Let's put these off to the side. And I think the other thing is maybe what I'll do to give it a little bit of reprieve is have it as a lead unit behind my powered B and see if it can do the same thing. So let's try it by itself. Look at that, it's pulling them. That's where it stops. If you remember, we had the 1950s era die-cast frame pulling like 5 or 6 cars. So let's go and bring it back to that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's try 5 cars. I'm just going to decouple it right there. And let's see if it can start on the hill with 5 cars. Kinda. Nope, not 5. How about 4? Nope. How about 3? 3 cars. How about 3? Nope. How about 2? There we go. All right, so it can pull 2 cars up that grade, which means it can probably pull 4 or 5 cars on the flat. And, you know, like I said, it's kind of hampered. It doesn't have magnet traction or rubber traction tires or nothing. It's just got those very simplistic, that very simplistic setup. See whether or not that, as a lead, combined with my modified dummy there, maybe if it can pull all those cars. My guess is it probably can. That's why I modified that one, so we could have that kind of a scenario where pretty much any of the ALCO setups, whether it's my old New Haven or this guy right here, can pull a, you know, train like I want to pull on my particular layout. So we're going to call this right here the redneck dynamometer for ALCO locomotives. This little hill right here we got to climb. So I went digging through archives, and I kind of found this information from a variety of different places. And I was trying to research what road names I was going to pick, because I knew I wanted either New Haven, Lehigh Valley, or Erie. Information's online if you choose to hunt for it, and in a variety of different spots. So I haven't decided, do I go New Haven because I can get shells from Lionel already pre-painted, or do I pick one of these two and paint them that way? And actually, Erie Lackawanna is another one that railroad inherited some of these FAs that the Erie Railroad had. You know, and I found this online. And interestingly enough, my first question is it something that can be copyrighted? And so you turn the page. It's a reproduction. So they basically kind of ripped off the manual, made a copy, but it actually has good information. And what's really good, this is where I found information on the ALCOs. They have a good section on the sheet metal frame 200 series ALCO diesel locomotives sold by Lionel. I almost wish I had this last week. But if you look right here in the chart that they have, look at that. They give you the road names that Lionel had sold these sheet metal ALCOs, and none of them match what I need. The 1950s era die-cast, they had the Erie, but these didn't. So I'm going to have to hack them. The only thing that's even close is the New Haven. They're in here somewhere, right there. But also look at the options they had, where you had magnetic axles, 1, 2, or nothing, right? And then the horn, they had horns, that was another option, and then also the reverser. So there was 3 different options that came along with that series of locomotives. And you don't want one of those. And here's that little Texas 1055, 1959, that had no magnetic axles and no front couplers. See that right there as a side note? So that's good information, right? You recognize that? So I bought this, and this has turned out to be quite valuable. So I'll highly recommend that.